In the comments section of one of the previous 7 videos, someone challenged me to a debate on universal salvation. I sent a PM pointing out that I will be glad to debate, but only in defense of the version of Christian universalism presented in these videos, not the status quo versions found all over the internet today. Not surprisingly, the conversation ended there. Having spent more than 20 years working on the concepts presented in the previous videos, I've come to understand that Christians, including Christian universalists, have a difficult time discussing the salvation of all from this perspective. We know how to argue one doctrine against another, but aside from scholars, few seem to know how to explore an unconventional interpretation of the Bible on the basis of its ability to pass truth criteria. This becomes painfully apparent when discussion turns to the allegorical. Thomas Aquinas pointed out in his Summa Theologica that from the initial meaning of words, God has the ability to signify further meaning. The first meaning is literal, the second is spiritual. Modern theological scholarship teaches us we are to focus only on the literal, that anything spiritual we think we see in Scripture beyond the obvious metaphors of the Bible are figments of our own imagination and not from God. Because this view has long been prevalent in Christianity, virtually all discussion about doctrine takes place within the parameters of one-dimensional literalism. To understand the allegoric structure presented here requires reading the Bible in something of a two-dimensional format. Philosopher William James used an analogy that's helpful to aid our understanding. He noted that individual paints were, by themselves, merely various pots of saleable matter, but combined and spread on a canvas in certain ways, a picture arises, and this is a spiritual function. This is a good lesson to keep in mind about God's allegorical presentation of salvation in the Bible. He has orchestrated particular individuals within certain circumstances as individual paints on his canvas of history to show us his plan of salvation for every human being through the sacrifice and atonement of Jesus, the Christ from Nazareth. God uses literal elements to paint meaning pictures. Grasping this concept firmly in mind is necessary to grasp his allegoric pattern. Understanding this structure requires thinking beyond individual metaphors. Single metaphors are like individual subjective ideas. Each, considered alone, has no ability to convey a complex semantic structure. We have no way of testing the truth of single metaphors. In contrast, the allegoric structure is coherent and systematic. It's formed by multiple unified individual metaphors that reference the key interpretive features of a single supervising metaphor. While literalism steers the mind to the plain historical sense of Scripture and its associated meanings, the allegorical requires an ability to distinguish both literal and symbolic meaning simultaneously in the Bible. The allegoric method upholds God's authorship of Scripture to a much higher degree than traditional doctrine. While wonderful significance between Old and New Testaments and their authors on a moral and fundamental level is seen in the literal, only a vastly higher intelligence than the human intellect could have established such a consistent, unified organization of symbolic meaning arising from the literal by multiple authors with diverse backgrounds over many centuries of time. To orchestrate such a system of metaphors over centuries is obviously completely beyond human capability. The allegorical structure rips authorship of the Bible from the human hands most modern scholars claim it belongs and places it back in God's. So, how is the allegoric organization for the salvation of all found in the Bible? It's formed from a collection of metaphors. These metaphors are united by their shared meaning elements. It works like this. First, a principal metaphor provides the allegoric blueprint by establishing a few fundamental interpretive rules or conventions. Video number 4 in this series details the principal metaphor, the story of God's well-known discussion with Abraham concerning Sodom and its destruction in Genesis chapters 18 and 19. The base interpretive conventions the principle establishes suggest that God will not destroy a whole in which some good exists, but separates bad elements and destroys them while preserving and cultivating the good. This principle, found throughout the Bible, brings about the idea that God is showing us how he performs his work in human essence or spirit, sometimes also referenced as the soul. Thus, the human spirit or soul is portrayed metaphorically in Scripture as a whole made up of many parts. The spiritual often bears analogical resemblance to the physical world, and the way to understand the soul is that it exists in a multitude of value elements, much like the physical body exists as a single whole made up of individual cells. The big difference is where the body's cells are made of substance or matter, the soul's elements are pure value. Each component of spirit exists in either a true or false state. Another crucial convention to understand is that God never destroys true elements, only false. Because God is pure truth, the perfection of his justice requires that only the false which produces evil is ever destroyed. This principle is borne out completely in countless passages of the Bible. These interpretive rules established in the principle metaphor are given semantic authority by dozens of what I call level 1 metaphors. Level 1 metaphors are found among the symbolic passages of the Bible, many from the Old Testament prophets. Level 1 metaphors have one or more shared meaning elements with the conventions found in the principle metaphor. Together, the principle and its level 1 metaphors create the allegoric interpretive standard, or simply the standard for short. It's here that the allegory gains its systematic structure. The term allegory is used here just as a collection of unified metaphors. Multiple metaphors with no common meaning are, from a semantic standpoint, incoherent. They form no logical organization. But level 1 metaphors share meaning with each other and with the principal metaphor to cohere in somewhat the way words unite to form meaningful sentences. The standard is not all there is to the allegoric method. It's further reinforced and brought to life by what I call level 2 metaphors. The contribution of level 2 metaphors to the allegoric structure differs from level 1 metaphors. Level 1s are always from the figurative language passages and are read as concurrent with the interpretive framework of the principal metaphor. In other words, level 1 metaphors find and unite with the principal metaphor. Level 2 metaphors are not only from symbolic passages, but often from non-metaphoric wording or text that isn't normally considered to be metaphoric in nature. Level 2s are uncovered or found in Scripture by the standard. Actually, the principal metaphor is itself a level 2 representation. There's nothing immediately obvious about God's conversation with Abraham or Sodom's destruction that suggests these passages are metaphoric in nature until they're found after the fact to unite with level 1s to create the allegoric standard. Unlike the immediate unity level 1s have with the principle in creating the standard, level 2 metaphors lend themselves to interpretive alliance with the standard in a subsequent role. Bear in mind that salvation is a two-part process, death and resurrection, or destruction and restoration. Wrath always precedes grace. Jesus tells us in John chapter 12, verse 24, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains by itself alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." The principal metaphor outlines the first, or death part, of these two aspects of salvation, the separation of true from false and destruction of the latter. God's grace in the restoration of what was lost in destruction, while emerging in some of the level 1 metaphors, is generally treated in more detail in the level 2s. Here are a few examples of the dozens of level 1 metaphors that align with the standard by their common meaning with one or more of the interpretive conventions of the Genesis 18:19 principle. Matthew chapter 13 verses 24 to 30 is the parable of wheat and tares. Wheat can readily be seen to represent good parts or elements of truth in the soul, and tares symbolize the false. The false are separated from the whole and destroyed in accordance with the conventions of the principal metaphor. Ezekiel 21 verses 2 to 5 speaks of the sword of God separating righteous from wicked from the whole of Israel. Again, we find the separation of good from bad, just as the righteous were separated from the unrighteous in Sodom. Note the passage's universal aspect, that this division is decreed by God through Ezekiel to be to all flesh. Jeremiah 5 verses 10 to 11 speaks to the destruction of bad branches from the whole vine. God's command to not execute a complete destruction accords with the metaphor of Sodom's destruction, where the few righteous were separated and the unrighteous majority destroyed. The idea that the bad are a majority is a common theme in Scripture found in both Testaments. In the 24th chapter of Jeremiah, the notion of true and false elements is rendered by good figs and bad. Notice that good and bad can apply to both individuals and to constituent parts within each individual in the same passage. In time, this righteous-unrighteous distinction has application to persons, but God's eternal decree is that the false be removed from all his creation, assuring a universal application of restoration eventually. In Jeremiah 24, those deemed righteous by God were being separated from the whole of Israel and sent to wilderness captivity to be spared, while the unrighteous were left in the land to meet their destruction. Remember that the designation unrighteous, when applied to persons, is only a temporary application in time. Included in these passages is a promise of salvation's second aspect, God's pledge of restoration. I will set my eyes on them for good, and I will bring them again to this land, and I will build them up and not overthrow them, and I will plant them and not pluck them up, and I will give them a heart to know me, for I am the Lord, and they will be my people, and I will be their God, for they will return to me with their whole heart. Isaiah chapter 65 verses 8 to 9 is a powerful metaphor in which God declares through Isaiah, as new wine is found in the cluster, and one says, do not destroy it, for there's benefit in it, so I will act on behalf of my servants in order not to destroy all of them. The decree to not destroy the whole cluster because of the good grapes in it again parallels the substance of the Sodom story. The cluster appears as a whole in which both good and bad grapes exist. The one who stands as intercessor, preventing a complete destruction, obviously references Christ. Once the bad elements are removed, a rebirth to new life is promised. And I will bring forth offspring from Jacob, and an heir of my mountains from Judah. Even my chosen ones shall inherit it, and my servants shall dwell there. In Amos 9, verses 8 to 10, although God will destroy the sinful nation from the face of the earth, yet he will not totally destroy the house of Jacob. The house of Jacob can be seen to represent the whole, and the promise to destroy the sinful nation speaks metaphorically to the cause of sin, fragmental falsity in human spirit. That God will not destroy the whole in which some good exists is portrayed in his separation of good from bad. As grain is shaken in a sieve, not a kernel or no component of truth will fall to the ground, but all sinners, or false elements, are given over to the sword. This metaphor conforms fully with the value separation feature of the principal metaphor depiction of Sodom's destruction. Matthew chapter 25 verses 32 to 46 is one of the more popular salvation passages in the New Testament. Here, the concept of all nations represents the whole. Sheep are separated from goats in the familiar pattern established in the Genesis 18:19 passages. The eternal punishment decreed in verse 46 moves in symbolic language from individuals to the goat portions within each person. In other words, eternality is not applied as duration of separation and punishment of individuals, which, as the principal metaphor reveals, would be a violation of God's perfect justice, but is a decree of the banishment of all things false from the perfection of existence in the New Jerusalem of Revelation 21, a type of heaven. Zechariah 13, verses 8 to 9. In the totality of all the land, true and false parts are portrayed in a somewhat unusual quotient of measurement by Zechariah, as 2 parts in it being cut off, representing the bad, yet the third, or good, will be left in it. The third part is then refined in fire as silver is refined and as gold is tested. This cleansing is, in the allegoric system, recognized to be the hellfire of purification, producing the following result. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. Being exposed to godly fire results in restoration of the whole. This is one example among many in the Bible that hell is itself a metaphor for cleansing and restoration, not an eternal place of separation and suffering for individuals, as the literal reading of the Bible leads us to suppose. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 to 15, the products of the true are goods represented by gold, silver, and precious stones, and the false as wood, hay, and straw. The latter are tested in the purifying fire of absolute truth. The false is destroyed from the whole, the true remains. Here is yet another passage consistent in its metaphoric sense with the interpretive criterion of the principle. Not all passages that have level 2 association are technically metaphors. Some passages that are more properly moral teachings, and in some cases mere expressions within passages, have level 2 metaphoric value by their association with the allegoric structure. An example of the metaphoric value of an expression is the contradistinction of spirit and flesh used by Paul, Peter, and Jesus in the New Testament. While base literal meaning of the words alludes to material body and immaterial spirit, spirit and flesh transfer readily as symbolic concepts to good and evil natures within humans. The meaning of these terms can reduce further in the allegoric system to truth and falsity in human essence when context allows. On a side note, this view of truth and falsity as value has application in Christian thought beyond staining the soul and requiring removal. Value theoretically plays an immense role in moral apprehension, making spiritual vitality the primary factor in moral matters. Jesus noting that the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak can be accounted for as mental characteristics imposed by inner values. The natural opposition of tension and resistance between truth and falsity in spirit would produce dispositions to sin. To the extent the soul exists in a true state, it will exist in union in intellectual operation with higher or absolute truth. Paul alludes to this relationship between spirit and cognition in Romans chapter 8, verses 5 to 6. Isaiah chapters 34 and 35, taken together, qualify as a level 2 metaphor as explained in Albert Barnes' commentary. The 34th and 35th chapters make one distinct and beautiful prophecy consisting of 2 parts. The first containing a denunciation of judgment on the enemies of the Jews, particularly Edom, Isaiah 34, and the second a most beautiful description of the flourishing state of the people of God which would follow these judgments, Isaiah 35. From a historical perspective, Edom was a people descended from Esau. Scripture reports in Malachi chapter 1 verse 3 and Romans chapter 9 verse 13 that God hates Esau. Many Christians recognize that God's love for Jacob and hatred for Esau represents the spirit and flesh, or true-false and righteous-unrighteous dichotomy. The allegoric view moves God's hatred from individuals to the stain of falsification within each of us. Thus, the enemies of Israel, and metaphorically every human being is Israel, don't exist outside him, but inside. God, who is pure truth, hates the false. Falsity keeps his people chained to sin, and all the destruction decreed against Israel's enemies in the Bible is actually a pronouncement and promise of ruin to all things false within the spirit of every human being. This is, of course, at the same time, a promise of blessing and salvation to every person. Note the death to resurrection model and movement from God's wrath in Isaiah chapter 34 to his blessing in chapter 35. Though it's uncomfortable and difficult for human minds to grasp, the land of Edom, destroyed in Isaiah 34, is a microcosm of the true Satan, the harlot of Babylon and Revelation, whose minions take the mark of the beast. All these suffer the same fate as Edom. God shows us the same process through different authors in diverse historical circumstances. The demise of the king of Babylon in Isaiah 14, found in verses 22 to 27, parallels Edom's fate in Isaiah 34 and that of the minions of Babylon in Revelation 14, verses 8 to 11. All these are Satan, and Satan is expressed through every sinful thought and act of every human being. Fortunately, judgment is pronounced not on us, but on our fallenness, and the smoke of our falsity is decreed to ascend and depart from us eternally, forever and ever. This is the power of truth in God's allegoric system. Literalism can only get part way to the truth before it gets mired down in doctrines that present long-standing logical tensions, which can only be resolved in the allegoric system. Falsity stains all souls and creates opposition to truth. This defect is the target of God's anger. Isaiah 34 is to Isaiah 35 as death is to resurrection, as destruction of the false is to restoration to a true state, and as the elimination of unrighteous components is to the benefit of the righteous whole. Note the double symbolic reference in verse 6 of Isaiah 34 that God's blood-filled sword is sated with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats. Lambs and goats fit into the allegoric system in Matthew 25 as true and false elements in the soul. What's interesting is that within the structure of allegory, the lamb-goat metaphor finds equally satisfactory expression as a description of whole persons as it does value elements within each soul. In time, the valid distinction between righteous and unrighteous persons is seen to be a temporal and temporary classification. When each soul passes into eternity, the false is eliminated and the person restored to a holy, true state. Barnes's commentary reveals one of the main shortcomings inherent to a literal interpretation of the Bible in its assumption that fury in hell falls only on bad people and blessing on good. The allegoric system, however, reveals that God's cleansing, like his love, is universal. Arguably, the most powerful level 2 metaphor in the Bible is the story of the Exodus, found primarily in the books of Exodus and Numbers. This powerful level 2 metaphor is explained in more detail in video 5 of this series. Generally, the nation Israel represents a person who hears God's call and heeds it, but false elements within him cause him to lose faith. Metaphoric Israel is a whole made up of many parts, as seen in Exodus chapter 12, verses 37 to 38. The rabble or mixed multitude of Numbers chapter 11, verse 4 correspond, along with the mixed multitude of Exodus 12:38, to false elements within Israel which influence him to lose faith and fall into frequent complaining. In response, God assigns Israel to a wilderness period where various hardships gradually destroy the false elements which caused his faith to fail. This is sanctification, a depiction of the restructuring of the soul by God to produce a higher truth state. This is an expression of God's love in that the higher truth state created in us in wilderness experiences produces faith and a new reception of the things of God. Hence, inner hellfire is the process that produces purity. Though God's pronouncements of wrath toward evil are aimed at individuals or nations as warnings of consequence for sin, those admonitions find their objective in destruction of falsity in human essence, a primary ingredient of the cause of sin. That he speaks past individuals to defect within the soul in Scripture is a concept not available to a literal understanding of the Bible. Consider Matthew chapter 18, verses 8 to 9. Here, Jesus uses a metaphoric depiction of the elimination of bad elements from the soul using literal elements of hand, foot, and eye to denote evil's fragmented aspect. Hands, feet, and eyes are obviously incapable of sinning of themselves, but his teaching makes perfect sense when these things represent false value elements in the soul, the raw material of sin and all manner of corruption, including the mind's tendency to reject prescriptive truth and the goods associated with it. Where it makes no sense in the literal to cut off body parts to stop sin, it's well within reason to expect the removal of the parts of the soul that cause it. Notice that the level 2 metaphors must be found after the standard is formed by the principle in level 1 metaphors. Level 2 metaphors cement the systematic structure of the allegorical system together and give rise to the magnificent power of God to hide his truth in plain sight within the Bible's pages. In summary, the allegorical presentation of salvation God wove into the Bible is difficult for today's Christian to see because we've been taught to read and understand the Bible literally. Literalism limits meaning to only what its human authors intended to say. The authorial intent doctrine embodies the primary stumbling block to understanding what the true author of Scripture, God himself, says in the Bible. Once we're able to think past the status quo literalism, God's allegoric presentation of the salvation of every soul is found to be more logically structured than the literal and offers a fuller sense of God's majesty, grace, love, and mercy for all humanity. For every death, the allegoric standard reveals a resurrection. For every burning, a restoration. For every shame, a healing. And for every sin, no matter how terrible, forgiveness.